Greetings, 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 everyone. How exciting it is to be a part of today's event. I know yesterday was amazing, great speakers, great content, and great engagement. And I hope to have the same thing from you. So I'm so excited and so thrilled to be here today to talk about my newest book, my latest bestseller, which is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Dummies. Yes. I'm going to tell you all about it, but let me first introduce myself. I am Dr. Shirley Davis, and I am a 30-year HR, DE&I, and business executive. So I have been working in every area of HR. I've headed up recruiting for 10 years. I led DE&I as a Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for several Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies, as well as the world's largest HR association. I've also worked in financial services and banking and retail sales and manufacturing and utilities, as well as working in nonprofit. I also have been an adjunct professor and guest lecturer at several universities and colleges around the country. I have worked in over 30 countries, 36 to be exact. But I am so excited about all of the experiences that led me to being called and asked by John Wiley & Sons, who is the publisher of nearly 3,000 books for dummies. I'm sure you all have one. One may be Cooking for Dummies or Science for Dummies or Math for Dummies. Hey, there's one, Love for Dummies. But I'm excited to be here to be the person that they asked to share my 30 plus years of experience in what it means to then do this work and what does it mean for how we integrate this into our organization. So I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes or so, and I want you to be a part of this conversation while I'm going to share with you about the book and how it came to be and what's in it, who's it for, and how it can impact the work that we do and even the work that you're doing. I want us to all engage. So if there's questions that you have, please put them in the chat box. I'm also going to give us time at the end to come on and have a discussion. And if you have questions, you can unmute yourself. You can you're going to bring your camera on and we can have a discussion. So let's get started. First of all, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion for dummies, this book was actually the first ever to be written in that series of dummies books. Now, you may ask that first question of, why would we have a dummies book, quote unquote, for diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because the two seem like an oxymoron, right? Doesn't one seem antithetical to the other? Well, I'm glad you asked. And I'm going to ask everyone, if you will, please mute yourselves as you come in. Thanks so much. Well, I have to give some consideration to that because you're exactly right? What will be having a dummies book for diversity, equity, and inclusion when dummies itself has a connotation? I had to look up and do some background research on the source and the brand and the reputation of Wiley & Sons. And what I found is that they have always been about making learning easy and the most simplistic and practical for anybody. So for some of us who, for example, statistics for dummies, I needed that because I self-identified that that's just an area I'm not good at. I don't have the information, the knowledge, or the expertise. So I self-identify as needing something, right? And dummies has so many different connotations, but I want you to understand that this is not to really talk about someone in a negative light. It really is for us to identify that there's information that we don't know and there's some knowledge we need to get, which is why they call all of their books, you'll see it called Learning Made Easy. That's what it's about. How do we make it practical? How do we make it relevant? How do I make this actionable and make this something that I can immediately apply back on my job and in my everyday life? So when we talk about this work, I want to kind of give you a breakdown of what it looks like. It has 21 chapters, over 300 pages. This is a book that has everything from how do you get started with diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do you understand like the fundamentals? Some people don't even have the understanding of what's the nomenclature, what is the terminology that's used and how it's continued to evolve. And in the book, which is amazing, I had an opportunity to do my own research in addition to my own expertise, was to add in there new and evolving terms that we hadn't been talking about. terms like neurodiversity and learning more terms in LGBTQ, learning more terms around disability. So it was really a learning experience for me as well. Also, it's about exploring some of the demographic shifts and the trends that are happening and how our workforce is being redefined, right? So we're increasingly global, we're increasingly more diverse, we're increasingly more digitized, and certainly working very differently. We're increasingly hyper-connected and increasingly complex. So these are some of the areas and aspects that we have to think about if we are going to effectively lead DE&I. It's also in the book, I talk about how to cultivate the skills and the competencies for every leader, every worker. We all have to recognize that we got to upskill and reskill, and that the workforce of today and yesterday is going to be different from the workforce of tomorrow and 10, 20 years from now. So what does that look like? And what are some of those skills and competencies that we need to design and develop and grow ourselves so that we are effective? How do we make the case for DE&I? How do we hire a chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer? I wanted to hit on that because I've hired several myself, but I've also been hired. And so it's important for us and for companies to understand that when it's time, and to know when it's time, to know how to hire the right person, right? There's so many people out there that's now getting into the role of DE&I and don't have a lot of experience or expertise or proven track records of success. So it's important that we hire the right person and not someone who's just hung up a shingle and now they're passionate about it, but they don't have that level of hands-on experience. The other part of the book I talk about is how do you examine DEI in the workforce, right? How do we assess the organization's culture? That's so important. More and more companies now that I'm working with as a consultant is that we are assessing how the company makes its decisions, how leaders lead across differences, what's the employee experience like, and what's the disconnect in communication and trust building and safety and psychological safety, right? And all of those aspects of DE&I. But I also talk about how do you implement and operationalize DE&I across the organization. So that's all about how do you source and recruit talent? How do you develop, coach, and promote as well as retain diverse talent or underrepresented talent or marginalized talent or whatever term you use, right? That's also evolving. That's another evolving term and aspect of DE&I. Also, how do we track and measure, and not only track and measure, but how do we report the progress of DE&I? How do we embed it in all these other key areas of the organization and not just only focus on getting more and then training, right? How do we make sure that in every aspect of the organization, DE&I is a part of the DNA, right? And then how do you also launch DE&I councils and employee resource groups? The book goes on to talk about how do you do all of that, and then how do you sustain DE&I in the organization? How do you understand the biases that play out, and how do you apply an equity lens into everything that we do? How do you move from unconscious bias to inclusive leadership? And how do you enhance your own cultural competence, but then how do you build a culture of inclusion, equity, belonging, and a culture of high performance? All of those are very important. And then the book ends with what they call the part of 10s. I love that because it gives you like 10 strategies or 10 tips or 10 considerations or best practices. And I chose to do 10 common myths about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also chose to do one on 10 ways that boards can influence DE&I in the organization. And then the last one I did was 10 things underrepresented talent wish their leaders knew. So I want to hit on that in just a second. So I wanted to just give you a good highlight of the book itself. I consider the book a one-stop resource, a roadmap, a reference guide to how to get a comprehensive understanding of what this work is all about, how it contributes to an organization's success, what's your role as a leader, and how to implement DE&I in every area of the organization. So I've hit on some of those areas, but I also shared a lot of my own personal experiences, being a woman, being a person of color, being a single mom, and having that personal perspective, but also being not only the person who has been marginalized, trivialized, minimized, discriminated against, overlooked, undervalued, as I tried to rise to the C-suite in my own career. And guess what? As I was doing that over my 30-year career, I'm still seeing people do that today. They're experiencing the same stuff that I experienced years ago. So our work that we do, and I'm president and CEO of SDS Global Enterprises, SDS, Strategic Development Solutions. And we're helping organizations to really put strategies in place, practices and processes, and train leaders in a way that creates a kind of culture where all talent can thrive. They can bring their most authentic self to work every day and feel valued, feel respected, feel heard, feel recognized and appreciated for their contributions. And the other thing that I did in the book too is I shared a lot of my own stories and the realities that not only I experienced, but I'm still seeing a lot of that today. So who's the book written for? You might think that all that I've shared, that it's written specifically for those of us who have drank the Kool-Aid and had the piece of cake and had the icing on top. No, it's not only for us, but this book actually, when Wiley and Sons reached out to me, they said, we want to write this book for the leaders and those who are really a little bit more removed from this, or who don't understand it, or quite frankly, who resist it. So the book speaks to middle managers and leaders at the top, even all the way up to board members who may not have the title of Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, but they have a responsibility, they have an obligation to lead diverse teams, to recruit, to hire, to engage, to develop, to mentor, to serve diverse customers, to foster a welcoming and inclusive and high-performing workplace culture. That's who it's for. So really, who it is, it's all leaders at all levels. They're the ones that can benefit from this. And look, quite frankly and honestly, they're the ones that need it the most. So as we talk about the book and the fact that, here's what's in it, here's who it's for, let me give you a couple of highlights from some of my favorite chapters in the book. So I've kind of gone through a number of the chapters. One of them is on creating a positive employee experience. So I want you to think about this in your own organization. And this, again, the book covers quite a bit of this, is what does your organization do to create a positive employee experience? What do you do as a leader, or what do your leaders do? How are you actually working to incorporate that equity lens and some of the things that you do to ensure that people feel seen, heard, and valued? So let me share with you a couple of examples, some practices that are things that leaders can implement, and some things that we're working with leaders on as well. And they're pretty simple, but leaders oftentimes underutilize them. So for example, create meaning and purpose, right? Workers want to feel that the work that they do is tied to something significant and bigger than they are. They want clear objectives and goals for how to achieve success, how to achieve their performance and the expectations. So we got to ensure that, these markers are aligned with the company's values, and that we are also living the values and walking the talk. We got to identify worker potential and help workers grow and develop new skills. We got to recognize and appreciate good work and recognize them for just the small things that are done, as well as the great things that are done. Recognize them along the way, the milestones. And guess what? They want to hear simple things like thank you. They want to know that you are recognizing the work, but then they also want to see you care, right? They don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So that's an important one. A couple of others: give the what and the whys of the task and leave the how to your staff. What does that mean? Give people more freedom, more flexibility, more autonomy to figure things out versus being micromanaged. Look, we are over that. Gone are those days of the micromanager and my way is the only way, or the highway. No, we want leaders who recognize that we can figure things out ourselves, and we want to have that level of flexibility. Also, just admit when you make mistakes and use them as teachable moments for the team. I love it when leaders are courageous enough and self-confident enough to say, I tried this and I failed at this, or I made this mistake, or here's what I learned. Because when you do that, you also give your team permission to share when they have also made mistakes. All right, so that's an important one. The other one too that I shared, I love this one in chapter 7, is on exposing some common organizational barriers. Let me ask you that question. What are some common organizational barriers that you're facing in your own organizations, particularly as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? what are some of the common organizational barriers? You can put those in the chat box. We'd love to see too from some of you. What are some of those that you face? Put them in the chat box, some common barriers. And maybe you don't face them directly, but you know, you have a friend, right? You have a friend who is facing some of those, or maybe some of these are things that you've heard some of the employees express that you're working on now to try to address. So that would be one as well. So I would say, yes, just share some of those in the chat box. And while those are coming in, here's a few that I've heard, right? Some of the common barriers is one is when companies say they're looking for an organizational fit, right? A culture fit. A lot of times we know that that's code for, like us, conforming to the way we look, think, and the ways that we do it, right? So we want to make sure we can dispel that barrier and really dismantle that barrier. Another one is resisting the value and the need for DE&I, right? So we got to figure out, how do we handle resistance and how do we help overcome some of that fear, right? So those are some others. And then another one might be perpetuating some of the microaggressions and the stereotypes and the prejudices, right? So we got to look at you know, ourselves to find out, where do we keep sharing things and specifically doing things, actions, or even in our words that could make people feel a bit devalued or insulted, or even, you know, just absolutely overlooked. So we have to make sure that we're taking care of those areas, and we all have opportunities. Not only do we ourselves have some of those experiences, but we too, because we have biases, we oftentimes can inject or project that onto others, or even sniffing out some of those prejudices. We gotta, as you know, leaders, we have to be willing to hold people accountable and call some of those things out as well. Also, sometimes what I found is another barrier to DE&I is that we overlook some of the hidden figures who are overperforming, but they're undervalued. I was one of them. I was that person that kept my head down, got the work done, made the sacrifices, got the results, and was very successful, but wasn't being recognized, wasn't being promoted, wasn't being looked at as giving that choice assignment or identified as, you know, a leader of the future. Not all the time. And so there are times where I was training my boss, right? Training people who didn't know it, but then I would train them and then they would become my boss or supervisor. How many of y'all been there before, right? That is some of our reality. So again, if you have some of those barriers that you're experiencing, please share some of those as well. These are just a few of them. Even sometimes one of the barriers is just that people feel shut down. They don't feel like they can bring their most authentic self to the workplace. And so they feel silenced. They feel like they're, invisible, and they feel like they're ignored. Even sometimes when they complain or they share some of their experiences, those things could also go unnoticed and unresponded to. So those are just some examples. Another great one for me in chapter 13, which is about how do you embed DE&I in other key areas of the organization. That's an important one because, again, we don't want this to be a one and done. We don't want the DE&I work, the work that we're doing. We don't want it to be a flavor of the month and a check the box exercise. This has to be something that becomes a part of what the organization does, how the organization holds people accountable, what are the expectations, the performance results that are expected, as well as can this be incorporated into things like marketing and branding, right? Yes, we want it to be a part of the employment brand, but this should be a part of our marketing efforts, messaging that we put out to the world. So we've got to look at how do we, one, avoid some of those missteps and cultural misappropriation, right? So we have to identify that, but also integrating DE&I to company communications, as well as connecting it to our environmental social governance and our corporate responsibility and community outreach. It has to be in that. It has to be embedded in our procurement, supply chain. It has to be embedded into our employee expectations and even into our strategy, our benefits program. So there's so many aspects and areas of how we need to think about embedding this. The other thing too that I included in the book, I love to talk about cultures as it relates to who's a high performing culture and who is a low performing culture, who's in the top tier, who's in the lower tier. And one of the things that I included in the book was a culture spectrum, because we want to make sure that companies take the long journey, right? Because there's a long journey and just a long ongoing process of moving their cultures from one part of what I call the red zone to what I call the green zone. Those red zone cultures is exactly what it sounds like, right? Red. You got some issues, you got some toxicity, you got some real areas that you need to address. And if you don't, you're going to be sacrificing employee engagement, retention, and even talent acquisition. You won't attract top talent. If people find that you have a culture in this red zone, a culture of silence, a culture of fear and retaliation, a culture of power and privilege, and culture where we have enablers and make excuses for why we do what we do and everything is okay, we've always done it this way, and a culture of exclusion and inaction and complacency, that's where you're going to lose a lot of people, and poor performance is going to be the result and the outcome. But so we need to move our cultures to a culture where we have an open door, open dialogue, where we have trust and respect, and where decisions are made based on principle and not power and privilege, where we move from excuses and enabling over to empowerment, where we move from exclusion to belonging and inclusion, and ultimately where we move from inaction and complacency to being a company that is proactive and take swift action as they need to, as they see the world changing. So that's what I call the cultural spectrum, and that's in the book as well. The other thing too is we talk about embedding DE&I in some of these other areas. You also have to think about how do you then embed it into your board strategy, into your governance, as I talked about as well, and embed this as a part of the CEO, C-suite, E-suite, executive competencies as well. And then the other thing I wanted to hit on that I talked about in the book, which is so important, is tracing, the rise of the equity, inclusion, and diversity officer, right? Here's some reality, some new things that I've seen in some of my research is in Standard & Poor's 500 index, researchers have found that hiring of chief diversity officers tripled over the last 16-month period, with an average of about 12 new positions filled each month. And I'm seeing that because I can't tell you every week, I can't tell you the number of search firms or organizations or my colleagues that are reaching out saying, do you know somebody? Do you know somebody? Do you know somebody? So we're seeing this real increase, which is a great thing. But I'm like, look, where y'all been at all my life? We've been trying to make DE&I officers' roles a key and critical part of the organization, and not something that's done off the side of somebody's desk, not something that's a part of a larger, broader role, and then putting people in these positions that they just handpicked from another part of the organization who've never had the experience. Not only have we seen this triple over the last 16 months, but out of that group, more than 60 firms reported hiring their first ever Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. And this has started since May of 2020. And you know what happened then. And so I'm really thrilled to see that. Even LinkedIn had some data in their workforce data report to shows that jobs that have the title of head of diversity or manager of diversity or director or even chief diversity officer increased 104% between 2015 and 2020. So yes, the role there is key and critical, and I can't tell you how important it is. But other factors that have really greatly influenced the rise of the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer includes the demographic shifts that we're seeing, right? More women, more people of color, people with different backgrounds, different cultures, people working differently, diversity of thought, people with different backgrounds, religious beliefs, political affiliations, people who speak different languages, all kinds of aspects of diversity. That is necessitating the real focus and the need to have a person in that role that can lead this work. Also, too, as you see the shifts in our marketplace, I talk about that in my chapter 2 about how the marketplace is changing, and that customers, clients, consumers, members, they are demanding that companies focus more on it, that companies can better relate to them, that products and services reflect their values as well. And then companies are also focusing more on their employer brand and their reputation. So everything from the benefits of appearing, like a great place to work list, and pressure from the inside, like board members and staff, but also pressure from the outside, like community groups and advocacy groups, and yes, the media and customers. Those are all the reasons why we're starting to see many more Chief Diversity Officers positions rise. So what I want to do, and again, looking for any of you have questions, don't forget to put those in the chat box as well. So here's one. Thank you so much for including this. One question comes from one of our attendees. It says, I think that unconscious bias is a difficult barrier to overcome because there are many people who don't realize that they have them. That's so true. Thanks, Denise, for sharing that. Yes, it really is a difficult barrier. So what we have to do is we have to have more conversations. We got to give examples and expose them. We got to create the right kind of culture and environment that it gives us a safe space to be able to call them out. I always say, look, throw something on the table, right? Like a flag or something that represents, hey, that was an ouch moment, right? Or that was a oh no moment. Let's talk about what was just said. Let's talk about what was just done. And when we create that kind of culture and that safe space where people feel comfortable calling it out and holding each other accountable, you're right, then we can start to decrease that barrier, that wall. We can bring that down. So the question is, how do newer employees try to influence DE&I upwards, which is so important. So that's kind of like that grassroots level. And so I think you have to start again by one, having those conversations. And when training is going on and listening sessions are being had or focus groups are being had, and also when you've got opportunities to share it on surveys and survey results and on pulse surveys, that's an opportunity to do it. But I think it can also start with you within your own unique team, your unit team, your specific project team that you have. Start to have conversations about it then. If there starts to be more of those kinds of conversations, they can then be trickled up. Or when there's impact, when there's success, that's another important piece. But make your voice heard at any level you are. Everyone has an ability to speak up. Everyone has an ability to share their opinions and their thoughts, and then to try to trickle that up. The other part too is newer employees. I always encourage them to become a part of an employee resource group or diversity business group, whatever might be in the organization, or if there's a diversity committee, maybe they don't have enough staff to have an ERG, but maybe they have a DEI committee. So be a part of those committees and be willing to share some of your thoughts, comments, and experiences and raise some of those issues. But the best way is to have formalized training and development and education and learning experiences where you're not only just talking about it, but you're having an opportunity to do some skill building. So that's very important and helpful as well. So the other thing I wanted to do is let me just real quickly close with a few of what I call the 10s. Remember I said that the book ends with the chapters on 10 things, 10 myths, 10 strategies, 10 tips. So let me give you one that I did in chapter 19, 10 common myths about diversity and inclusion. Look, here's one. When we check this box, we can move on to other priorities. That's a myth, not true. Isn't focusing on diversity just reverse discrimination? Ooh, that's another one that keeps coming up. What about what we're really after is diversity of thought? That's a myth. We need to focus on all aspects of diversity. Or another myth might be succeeding as a DEI practitioner will put me out of a job. If I'm successful, it's going to put me out of a job. Nope, we don't want to work our way out of a job. This is a job that I've been doing for 30 years and I could do it for 30 more years and we would still have some issues. Another common myth, DE&I has no place for straight white men. We got to address that. Or diversity is just code for race, right? So we can address that. Another one I want to share, some 10 ways that boards can influence DE&I in the organization. Let me give you a couple of those. Develop a DEI statement and center it in your business strategy. Also, establish clear board roles and responsibilities. Commit to diversifying your board and cultivate a culture of inclusion on your board and be willing to hold your CEO and DEI accountable. And the last one I'll share is a few of the 10 things underrepresented talent wish their leaders knew. Everybody has different needs in the workplace, right? So we wish y'all knew that, right? I'm an underrepresented talent. I'm a minority talent. I wish my leader knew that everybody has different needs in the workplace. It's not a one size fits all. Intent doesn't equal impact. That's another thing I wish that you knew. I wish you knew that diversity, equity, and inclusion are more than just about race. I wish you knew not to tokenize me because I'm the only one. And I wish you knew that you don't need to interpret my silence as consent or agreement. So those are just some of the examples of things that are in the book. I'm going to stop here. I know that we are just about at time now. And if there are any other questions, Please, please, please put some questions in or come off of mute, and you've got maybe a minute or so where you can ask a question. Let me tell you this, if someone is coming on, you can get a copy of the book on Amazon. You can go to Barnes and Nobles. It is on everywhere books are sold. So please make sure you go there. And I would encourage you, please link in with me. Please go to my Facebook page, my Instagram page, my Twitter. Stay connected with me. I'm constantly putting out new materials. I'm constantly doing work around DEI certificates of mastery. I'm training and coaching and mentoring leaders to do this work. And I just appreciate you being here today, and that you being a part of this important work, this important journey, and just recognizing that all of us are on this journey together, and we've all got some work to do. Thank you again. Have an amazing rest of the summit. Looking forward to seeing you back in the summit room. Appreciate you all. Take care.